August 1945. Camp 21, Comrie, Scotland. The medical tent smelled of iodine, damp canvas, and something sharper. The iron scent of blood. Rain drummed against the roof in steady sheets, and cold winds slipped through gaps in the fabric, making the paraffin lamp flicker. A British Army nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Webb, stood at the entrance holding a wet blanket, her boots muddy from the short walk across the compound. Inside, in the dim light, a young German woman sat on the edge of a cot, her arms wrapped around a small bundle pressed tight against her chest. "Ma'am, you need to let us see the child," Webb said softly in careful German. The woman did not move, did not speak. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the blanket. Her eyes, red from crying, stared straight ahead at nothing. When Webb stepped closer, she saw what made her breath catch. The bundle in the woman's arms was not moving, had not moved for hours. The child was dead. But the mother refused to let go. What happened next in that cold Scottish tent would force every person present to confront the cruelest truth of war, that sometimes love cannot save, only witness. This is a true story of loss, grief, and one moment of respect that crossed battle lines. Stay with me to the end, and if you want more real World War II stories like this, please like the video, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep bringing you these powerful histories. August 1945, Camp 21, Comrie, Perthshire, Scotland. The prisoner camp sat in a valley surrounded by hills that turned dark green in summer rain. Stone walls divided fields from forest. Sheep grazed on slopes too steep for crops. The camp itself was a collection of wooden huts, barbed wire fences, and guard towers that watched over nearly 2,000 German prisoners of war. The medical facility was a large canvas tent, reinforced with timber frames, set apart from the main barracks. Inside, 3 rows of cots lined the walls. The floor was packed earth, covered with wooden duckboards to keep patients off the mud. Blankets hung from ropes to create makeshift privacy screens. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet wool, and the constant dampness that seeped into everything in the Scottish Highlands. Lieutenant Sarah Webb was 29 years old, a nurse from Leeds who had served 3 years with the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. She had worked in field hospitals across France and Belgium, seen wounds that turned her stomach, held dying men as they called for their mothers. She thought she knew what suffering looked like. It was just past 7 in the evening when Corporal James Murray, one of the guards, appeared at the tent entrance, rain streaming off his helmet. "We have a situation in the women's section," he said. "German prisoner. She had a baby. The baby died this morning. She will not let anyone near her." Webb grabbed her medical kit and followed Murray into the rain. They crossed the muddy compound toward a smaller tent at the far end, marked with a red cross. This was the isolation ward, used for infectious cases or difficult births. Inside, 2 other nurses stood at a distance from a single cot. One was Captain Helen Morrison, the senior medical officer. The other was Nurse Jane Collins, barely 22, her face pale. Morrison looked up as Webb entered. "Thank God," she said quietly. "We have tried everything. She will not let us examine the child. She will not speak. She has been like this for 6 hours." Webb approached the cot slowly. The German woman sitting there was perhaps 24 or 25. Her hair was dark blonde, pulled back in a braid that had come loose. Her face was thin, hollow-cheeked, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of weeks without proper sleep. She wore a grey prison uniform dress, stained and wrinkled. Her feet were bare despite the cold. In her arms, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a baby, maybe 3 months old, maybe 4. The blanket was tucked tight, covering everything but a small face. The face was grey, the lips blue. There was no movement, no breathing, no life. The woman rocked slowly, back and forth. A rhythm that seemed mechanical, as if her body continued a habit her mind no longer registered. She hummed something, a tune Webb did not recognize. Soft, tuneless, broken. Webb knelt beside the cot, moving slowly, keeping her voice low. "Fräulein," she said in German, using the formal address. "My name is Sarah. I am a nurse. I need to help you. I need to see your baby." The woman's humming stopped. Her eyes shifted, focusing on Webb for the first time. They were grey eyes, empty and vast as winter sky. "9," she whispered. "He is sleeping. He needs to sleep. I must not wake him." Webb felt something tighten in her chest. She glanced at Morrison, who shook her head slightly. "The woman's name," Morrison said in English, "is Margaret Klein, age 24, from Dresden. She was captured in April near Hamburg, working as a refugee clerk. She was 6 months pregnant when she arrived here. She gave birth in late May. The baby was premature, underweight. We did what we could." "And the father?" Webb asked. "Killed at Stalingrad, January 1943. She has no other family listed. Everyone dead in the Dresden bombing. She is alone." Webb turned back to Margaret. She noted the details a nurse learns to see. The woman's hands, though gripping the bundle, were shaking slightly. Her lips were cracked and dry. There were dark stains on her dress, milk that had leaked and dried. Her body was still producing milk for a baby who would never feed again. To understand how Margaret Klein ended up in a Scottish prison tent, holding her dead son and refusing to let go, the story must travel back to Germany in the final year of the Reich, and to a city that would become a symbol of total war's most terrible face. In early 1944, Margaret lived in Dresden with her mother and younger sister. Her husband Franz had been drafted in 1942 and sent to the Eastern Front. He was a carpenter, not a soldier, but the Wehrmacht took everyone. His letters came regularly at first, short notes about cold and mud and missing home. Then the letters stopped. In February 1943, the telegram arrived. "Killed in action near Stalingrad." The words were printed in black ink on yellow paper. Margaret held it for a long time, reading it over and over, as if repetition might change the meaning. She was pregnant. 3 months. Franz never knew. She tried to write to him before he left, but the letter came back marked, "Addressee deceased." She kept it in a drawer, unopened, the envelope holding words he would never read. Dresden was considered safe in 1944. The city had been barely touched by the war, no factories, no military targets, just Baroque architecture, museums, and refugees who had fled from bombed cities to the east. Margaret's mother took in boarders to make money. Margaret worked in a ration office, stamping cards and filing papers. Her sister, Anna, only 16, helped care for refugees at a church shelter. Life was hard but manageable. Rations were tight. Fuel was scarce. But they survived. Margaret felt the baby moving inside her and tried to imagine a future. Maybe the war would end soon. Maybe she could raise this child in a world without bombs and telegrams. Then came February 13th, 1945. The night Dresden burned. The British bombers came first, dropping incendiaries that set fires across the old city. The Americans came the next day, finishing what the British had started. The firestorm consumed everything. Buildings collapsed inward, streets became rivers of flame. The heat was so intense it created its own wind, pulling people toward the fire like a terrible magnet. Margaret was 7 months pregnant. She and her mother and sister ran toward the Elbe River, trying to reach open ground. The air was thick with smoke and burning embers that fell like deadly snow. Around them, people screamed, burned, suffocated. Her mother fell. Margaret tried to pull her up, but the crowd pushed forward, separating them. She lost sight of her mother in the smoke. She never saw her again. She and Anna made it to the riverbank, pressed flat against cold mud, while the city burned behind them. When dawn came, Dresden was gone, just rubble and bodies and smoke that rose in columns visible for miles. They searched for their mother for 3 days. They found only ruins. Their home was ash. The ration office was gone. Everything they owned had burned. They joined the streams of refugees moving west, away from the approaching Soviet forces, toward what they hoped might be safety. In late March near Hamburg, British forces captured their group. Margaret was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, starving. The British processed her paperwork, noted her condition, and eventually transported her to Scotland. To Camp 21. To a medical tent where, in late May, she gave birth to a son. She named him Franz, after his father. The birth was difficult. The baby was small, just over 4 pounds. He was weak, struggling to breathe, to feed, to thrive. The British nurses did what they could. They gave Margaret extra rations. They provided clean blankets. They checked the baby daily. But Camp 21 was not a hospital. Resources were limited, and a premature baby born to a malnourished mother had odds that no amount of kindness could fully overcome. For 3 months, Margaret fought to keep Franz alive. She fed him every 2 hours, waking from exhausted sleep to press him to her breast. She sang to him, German lullabies her own mother had sung to her. She kept him warm, wrapping him in every scrap of cloth she could find. She refused to accept what the nurses gently suggested, that he was fading, that his small body could not sustain itself, that sometimes love is not enough. On August 7th, 1945, Franz stopped breathing. It was early morning. Margaret woke to find him cold in her arms. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply held him closer, began to rock, and started humming. When the nurses came, she would not let them near. She sat on her cot, arms wrapped around her son, and disappeared into a place beyond words, beyond reason, beyond anything but the stubborn refusal to accept what her mind knew, but her heart rejected. Lieutenant Sarah Webb sat beside Margaret Klein for a long time, saying nothing. Rain continued drumming on the canvas. The paraffin lamp hissed softly. From somewhere outside came voices, the clang of metal on metal, the ordinary sounds of a camp that continued its routines regardless of one woman's private apocalypse. Webb had been taught, in her training, how to deal with death, how to close eyes, how to wrap bodies, how to speak to grieving relatives with professional sympathy. But this was different. This was not a soldier who had died quickly in battle. This was a mother holding her child, her last connection to everything she had lost, and refusing the final surrender. Captain Morrison stood at the entrance of the tent, arms crossed. "We cannot leave her like this," she said quietly to Webb. "The child has been dead for hours. In this heat, even with the rain, there will be decomposition. She is a health risk to herself and others. We must take the child." "How?" Webb asked. "By force. You have seen what happens when we try to get close." She screams. She fights. Yesterday she bit Nurse Collins hard enough to draw blood. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then we sedate her. We have morphine. We put her to sleep and remove the child while she is unconscious." "That is not care," Webb said. "That is violation." "It is necessity," Morrison replied. "I do not like it either. But we have responsibilities." She gestured toward the other nurses. "Collins is traumatized. The guards are asking questions. Other prisoners are frightened. We must resolve this." "Give me 1 more hour," Webb said. "Let me try 1 more time. If she will not release him by then, we do it your way." Morrison considered, then nodded. 1 hour, no more. After Morrison left, Webb sat in silence, thinking. She had seen grief before. Wives weeping over dead husbands, mothers collapsing at telegrams. But this was something else. This was grief that had calcified into denial, a mind protecting itself by rejecting reality. She thought about her own losses, her brother killed at Dunkirk, her fiancé shot down over Germany. She had cried for them, raged at their absence, slowly learned to live with the empty spaces they left. But she had been able to grieve because she had community, support, purpose. Margaret had none of these. She had only a dead baby and the certain knowledge that once she let go, she would have nothing left. Webb stood and walked to the supply cabinet. She found what she was looking for, a small wooden box that held the camp chaplain's equipment. Inside was a Bible, a cross, a bottle of holy water, and a white cloth used for wrapping the dead. She took the cloth and returned to Margaret. "Fräulein Klein," she said softly. "Margaret, I know you can hear me. I know you know your son is gone, but I also know you cannot let him go alone. So I want to help you. Will you let me help you?" Margaretta's rocking slowed slightly. Her eyes, which had been staring at nothing, shifted to Webb's face. "In my country," Webb continued, "when a baby dies, we prepare them for burial with care. We wash them. We dress them in clean clothes. We wrap them in white cloth. We say prayers. We give them dignity. Your son deserves this. You deserve to do this for him. Will you let me help you prepare Franz?" The use of the child's name seemed to penetrate where other words had not. Margaret's grip loosened slightly. Her lips moved, forming the name. "Franz," she whispered. "Yes," Webb said. "Franz. Your son. Let us care for him together, you and I. So he is ready for his final rest." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Margaret's arms began to loosen. Her hands, which had gripped the blanket for hours, relaxed. She looked down at the bundle in her arms, then back at Webb. Her face crumpled. A sound came from her throat, raw and broken, the first real cry she had made since the child died. Webb moved quickly. She knelt and gently took the bundle, feeling the small weight, the terrible stillness. She laid it carefully on the cot beside Margaret. Then she took Margaret's hands in her own. "Together," she said. "We do this together." What happened next, Lieutenant Sarah Webb would later write in a letter to her sister, was the most sacred thing I have ever witnessed. She brought warm water in a basin, clean cloths, a small cotton gown that someone had donated months ago. She unwrapped the blankets slowly, revealing the tiny body. The baby's skin was grey-blue, the face peaceful, as if sleeping. Margaret made a sound, half sob, half moan, but she did not pull away. Webb washed the child gently, carefully, as if he could still feel. She washed his face, his small hands, his feet. Margaret watched, tears streaming silently down her face. When Webb finished, she handed Margaret the cotton gown. "Will you dress him?" she asked. Margaret's hands shook as she took the gown. She lifted her son's body, and for the first time in hours, she truly looked at him. She touched his face, his hair, his tiny fingers. She dressed him slowly, fumbling with the small ties, crying quietly the entire time. When he was dressed, Webb brought the white cloth. She showed Margaret how to wrap it, fold it, tuck the edges. They worked together in silence, creating a small, dignified bundle. When they finished, Margaret held him again, but differently now. Not clinging in denial, but cradling in farewell. "I am sorry," Margaret whispered. "I am sorry. I could not save you. I tried. I tried so hard." Webb placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You loved him," she said. "That is what saved him from being alone. That is what you gave him. Love." At that moment, Captain Morrison returned with another nurse and the camp chaplain, Reverend Thomas Gray. They stopped at the entrance when they saw Margaret holding the wrapped bundle, Webb sitting beside her, both women with tears on their faces. Morrison's expression softened. "She is ready?" she asked quietly. Webb nodded. "She is ready." Reverend Gray was a small man with white hair and a kind face. He had buried too many soldiers, said too many final prayers. He approached slowly, giving Margaret time to see him. to understand. "Fräulein Klein," he said in careful German. "May I say a blessing for your son?" Margaret looked at him, then at the bundle in her arms. She nodded once. Gray opened his small prayer book. He read from Psalms, his voice gentle and clear. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters." The English words flowed over the German mother, a language she might not fully understand, but whose tone carried comfort. When he finished, he made the sign of the cross and bowed his head. That was when it happened. Morrison, standing at attention by habit, raised her hand to her forehead in a slow, deliberate salute. Then Gray did the same. Then Nurse Collins, standing behind them, tears streaming down her young face. Then Webb, still kneeling beside Margaret. One by one, the British staff in that tent saluted the German mother and her dead child. Not a military salute for a soldier, but a gesture of respect. Of acknowledgement, of shared humanity in the face of unbearable loss. Margaret saw it. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly. For a moment she seemed unable to process what was happening. Then, slowly, she stood. She held her son close with one arm and raised her other hand to her forehead, returning the salute. The movement was clumsy, unpracticed. But it was there. A recognition. An acceptance. A thank you. The room went still. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, time seemed to suspend itself around this moment. Enemies saluting each other, not in war, but in grief, finding common ground in the oldest human pain. Morrison lowered her hand first. "We will arrange a proper burial," she said to Margaret, through Webb's translation. "In the camp cemetery, with a marker. You may attend, if you wish." Margaret nodded. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." Webb helped her lay the small bundle on the cot one final time. Margaret smoothed the cloth, touched her son's face through the fabric, then stepped back. She swayed slightly, and Webb caught her elbow. "When was the last time you ate?" Webb asked. "I do not remember," Margaret said. "Come," Webb said. "You need food. You need rest. You have done what you needed to do. You have said goodbye with dignity. Now you must care for yourself. Your son would want that." Margaret allowed herself to be led from the isolation tent to the main medical area. Webb gave her soup, bread, weak tea. She ate mechanically, as if food were a task rather than nourishment. But she ate. That was something. Over the next days, preparations were made for the burial. Camp 21 had a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley. British soldiers were buried there, a few civilians. Now a German baby would join them. Morrison fought with the camp commandant, Colonel Andrew Fraser, who initially refused. "We do not bury enemy prisoners with our own," he said. "He was not a soldier," Morrison replied. "He was an infant, 3 months old. We buried him once in his mother's arms. Now we will bury him in the ground, with respect. That is the right thing to do." Fraser, a veteran of the First World War who had seen enough of death, eventually relented. The burial was scheduled for August 10th. On that morning, a cold wind blew across the Scottish hills. Grey clouds hung low, threatening more rain. The cemetery was on the slope, surrounded by a low stone wall. Gravestones marked the British dead, soldiers' names, regiments, dates. At the far end, a small plot had been dug. Beside it stood a simple wooden cross. Margaret walked from the camp escorted by Lieutenant Webb and Nurse Collins. She wore a clean dress someone had found, dark blue, too large for her thin frame. Her hair was brushed and pinned. Her face was pale, but composed. Behind them came Captain Morrison, Reverend Gray, and surprisingly, Colonel Fraser in full uniform. Behind him, a dozen British nurses and medical orderlies who had asked permission to attend. And behind them, a group of German prisoners, women from Margaret's barracks who had heard what happened and wanted to show solidarity. The small coffin, built by a British carpenter from scrapwood, rested beside the grave. It was plain, unvarnished, but solid and well made. Someone had carved a small cross on the lid. Reverend Gray conducted the service in English, then repeated key portions in German. He spoke of innocence lost, of a child who never knew war, of a mother's love that transcended nationality. Margaret stood at the graveside, hands folded, tears silent on her face. When the coffin was lowered, the British soldiers present came to attention. Colonel Fraser saluted. Then every British person there, nurses, orderlies, guards, saluted. The German prisoners stood with heads bowed, hands over hearts. Margaret stepped forward and dropped something into the grave. A small folded paper. Later, Webb would learn it was the unopened letter she had written to France's father, the one that came back marked, "Addressee deceased." She had written in pencil at the bottom, "Now you are together. Please take care of our son." The grave was filled, the cross placed. The group dispersed slowly, quietly, back toward the camp. Margaret remained a moment longer, kneeling beside the fresh earth, whispering words no one else could hear. Webb waited at a distance, giving her space. When Margaret finally stood and turned, her face was different, still sad, still marked by loss, but no longer frozen in that terrible limbo between denial and acceptance. She had let go. Not because she wanted to, but because love sometimes means releasing what you cannot save. The war ended officially on May 8, 1945. But for Margaret Klein, the war ended on August 10, 1945, when she buried her son on a Scottish hillside and 40 people she had been taught to hate showed her kindness instead. She remained at Camp 21 until December 1945, when the first waves of repatriation began. By then, she had regained some weight, some colour in her face. She worked in the camp kitchen, helping prepare meals. She spoke little, but no longer disappeared into that empty place behind her eyes. Lieutenant Sarah Webb stayed in contact with her as long as communication was possible. In January 1946, Margaret sent a brief letter from a displaced persons camp in Hamburg. "I am alive," she wrote. "I do not know where I will go or what I will do, but I am alive, and I remember your kindness. I remember that when I thought the world held only cruelty, you showed me I was wrong." The letter ended. "Tell Captain Morrison and the others that I will never forget. Tell them that the salute they gave my son was the greatest gift anyone could give. It told me that even in war, even when we are enemies, we can still see each other as human. That is what I will remember. Not the bombs, not the loss, but the salute." Webb kept the letter in a box with other correspondence from the war. In 1967, when she retired from nursing, she donated her papers to the Imperial War Museum. Among them was Margaret's letter, a photograph of the grave at Camp 21, and her own detailed account of August 1945. Captain Helen Morrison continued serving with the army until 1952, then opened a private practice in Edinburgh. In a 1978 interview for a nursing journal, she was asked about her most memorable case. She described Margaret Klein without hesitation. "It taught me," she said, "that our duty as medical personnel extends beyond healing bodies. Sometimes we must witness grief. We must hold space for the unbearable. And we must recognize that the person suffering, regardless of their uniform or nation, deserves dignity." That salute was not protocol. It was humanity, and I believe it mattered more than any medicine we could have given. Colonel Andrew Fraser's decision to allow the burial was noted in his service record. Some superior officers criticized it, others quietly approved. Fraser never commented publicly, but his aide later reported that he attended the grave monthly until he retired, placing wildflowers on the small plot. "He lost his own son at Arnhem," the aide said. I think that baby represented every son lost in that stupid war. Reverend Thomas Gray continued as camp chaplain until 1946, then returned to civilian ministry in Aberdeen. He mentioned the burial in several sermons over the years, always emphasizing the same point: that in our darkest moments, when grief threatens to destroy us, simple acts of respect and recognition can bring us back from the edge. A salute, a prayer, a gesture that says, "I see you, I acknowledge your pain, you are not alone." The grave at Camp 21 remains. The camp itself was dismantled in 1948, but the cemetery was preserved. Today, it is a memorial site maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and local volunteers. Among the rows of British soldiers lies one small grave marked Franz Klein, infant, August 1945. Someone, identity unknown, places flowers there regularly. In summer, wildflowers grow around the wooden cross. Margaret Klein herself disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. No further letters reached Lieutenant Webb. No records trace her movements after early 1946. She may have remarried. She may have rebuilt a life. She may have died young, worn down by loss. The archive holds no answers, only silence. But in that silence, there is also testament. 40 witnesses saw what happened in a Scottish prison camp in August 1945. 40 people carried the memory. Some wrote it down. Some told children and grandchildren. Some, like Morrison and Webb, preserved official records. And through those scattered remembrances, the story survived. It survived because it mattered, because it showed something people needed to see. That war does not erase our humanity. That enemies can show each other kindness. That a mother's love for her child transcends borders, uniforms, and politics. That a simple salute can speak volumes when words fail. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality lived in one tent, one burial, one moment of respect that 50 people never forgot. In a world that had spent years teaching people to hate, a group of British nurses and soldiers chose differently. They saw a grieving mother. They honoured a dead child. They gave dignity where the war had taken everything else. The greatest victories of World War II were not won with guns. They were won in small moments like this, when protocols were set aside, when enemies were seen as humans, when the machinery of war paused long enough for compassion to slip through the cracks, when nurses saluted not because regulations required it, but because their hearts demanded it. Margaret Klein lost everything to the war: her husband, her mother, her sister, her home, her son. But in her darkest hour, in a foreign country, surrounded by people who had every reason to see her as the enemy, she received something unexpected: respect, dignity, recognition that her pain mattered, that her child mattered, that she mattered. And when she stood and saluted back, tears on her face, a dead baby in her arms, she proved something profound: that even when war takes everything, it cannot take our capacity to see each other, to acknowledge suffering, to stand together, if only for a moment, in the face of unbearable loss. The room went still that August evening in 1945, not in silence, but in reverence. And in that stillness, 40 people learned something about themselves. That being human is not about victory or defeat. It is about recognizing pain and responding with kindness. About seeing an enemy mother and treating her with the same respect you would want if positions were reversed. They gave her a salute. She needed it more than medicine, more than food, more than anything medical science could provide. She needed to know her son's brief life mattered, that his death was witnessed, that his mother's love was seen and honoured. And because 40 people chose compassion over protocol, one broken woman found the strength to let go, to bury her child, and to keep living. That was the victory, not military, not political, but human, and it echoed longer than any bomb, any battle, any border ever could.